Our first presenter today will be Elise LeCompte, Registrar and Assistant Department Chair of the Florida Museum of Natural History.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to be talking today on a number of different subjects, but related to collections management policies and collections development policies, and giving you an introduction to what those are. Museums, in some way or another, make their unique contribution to the public by collecting, preserving, and interpreting the things of this world. Libraries and archives make their unique contribution by preserving and sharing information. Museums, libraries, and archives are grounded in the tradition of public service. They are organized as public trusts, holding their collections and information as a benefit for those that were established to serve. The stewardship of collections and information entails the highest public trust and carries with it the presumption of rightful ownership, permanence for museums, care, documentation, accessibility, and responsible disposal. In order to fulfill these fiduciary obligations, every cultural institution that owns, cares for, and/or uses collections must have some guiding principles to govern its collections-related activities. A collections policy articulates professional standards regarding collections and serves as a guide for staff and as a source of information for the public. In museums, this policy is referred to as a collections management policy. In libraries and archives, this policy is called a collections development policy. Another type of collections document is a collections plan. Collections plans are significantly different from collections policies. Sometimes collections professionals confuse the two and use the two terms interchangeably. We will explore what a collections plan is and how it is different from a collections policy later in the presentation. Without clear direction, poor decisions may be made as to what to collect, how to refuse donations, how to get rid of collections. Collections policies provide clear guidelines for institutions' governing authorities, staff, and constituents about standards and best practices, as well as legal and ethical requirements related to sensible acquisition and disposal, care and preservation, security and accountability, and documentation of collections. Collections policies are a tool that can help a museum, library, or archive stick to its mission statement when confronted with confusing, contradictory, or unethical pressures. They define goals for the development and use of the collections. They keep the institution focused on what it is really trying to do. Simply put, they spell out what the institution wants, what it does not want, and what it is going to do with what it has. They prepare an institution to face controversial activities or unexpected eventualities, such as needing to deaccession or a disaster endangering the collection. The best defense against costly mistakes and/or poor decisions is prevention. In today's world, an essential preventive measure is the adoption and implementation of a formal collections management or development policy. The purpose of a collections management or development policy is to minimize risk to the collections. They identify the staff responsible for the collections and provide a framework for collections management. Most importantly, they help the museum, library, and archive to meet their fiduciary responsibility by enabling the governing authority to meet its legal, ethical, and public trust obligations to protect the collections and make them accessible. Any collections policy should be based on the institution's mission or purpose statement, as well as its scope of collections. Other statements, such as vision or impact statements, should also influence the content of the policy. The form and content of any collections policy must be tailored to the individual museum, library, or archive. Good collections policies are influenced by the institution's history, community, audiences, governing structure, tradition, and other internal and external policies. It is perfectly fine to review examples from other institutions similar to yours, or to call on colleagues for advice and input. However, the policy will only be successful if it takes into account the specific purpose, organization, and activities of your own institution. To be effective, a collections policy must be simple and easy to abide by. If it is too complex, it becomes difficult or impossible for the staff to follow it. Jargon should be avoided. And terms such as collection object, artifact, specimen, and material should be clearly defined. Rules should be stated in a positive manner rather than in a dictatorial manner. The reasons for restrictions should be explained. Doing so will make it easier for staff to understand why they should follow the policy, as well as be more inclined to do so. The completed policy must be approved by the entity charged with the overall governance of the institution. This could be the museum or library director, the board of directors, or the trustees, or even a provost or president if the museum, library, or archive is part of a college or university. Once in effect, the policy serves as a formal delegation of responsibilities for all collections-related activities. Collections policies are living documents. They cannot remain stagnant. They are useless if they are outdated or ignored. They should be reviewed and updated on a predetermined periodic basis, say every 5 years. They should also be reviewed and updated if the institution undergoes any radical change, like renovation or construction of a new facility, even if the event falls before the time of the regular update. In practice, the collections management policy is actually a set of related policies. These core policies include acquisition, deaccession or disposal, collections care, loan, and access and use, which includes access and control of intellectual property rights. These core policies are augmented by ethics policies, emergency preparedness policies, and collections plans. The committee or team that is appointed to draft the collections management or development policy should include representatives from all areas of the institution that are involved in collections-related activities, such as administration, collections, exhibits, education, and security, to name a few. Input from a variety of viewpoints will ensure that the policy supports the institutional mission and it has the support of staff members who must implement it. Staff should have the opportunity to participate in each stage of the process, including reviewing successive drafts of the policy. Developing a collections management or development policy requires a lot of communication between the committee or team and the staff, as well as between the staff and the institution's governing authority. At all times during the development of the policy, do not lose sight of the fact that the objective of creating a collections management or development policy is to define areas of responsibility and guidelines and not to solve all problems. The first step in drafting a collections management or development policy is for the head of the institution, for example, the director, to assemble a committee or team and appoint the committee chair or team leader. Then the team makes a careful review of current legal, ethical, and professional standards and best practices in order to determine which have an impact on collections-related activities and should therefore guide the development of the policy. The committee or team also reviews any policies and procedures that the institution already has in place, because these too will have an impact on the collection management or development policy. Once that step is complete, the committee or team writes a first draft. The draft is circulated to all of the institution staff for review and comment. It may also be shown to the governing authority, for example, the board of directors or trustees, for their input. The committee or team revises the original draft based on the comments they receive. The new draft is circulated to all staff for further review and comment. This process is repeated until a consensus is reached, and the committee or team deems the draft ready to be presented to the governing authority for final approval. The final document is then presented to the institution's governing authority for formal approval. A collections management policy is a written document approved by the governing authority that specifies the museum's policies concerning all collections-related issues, including accessioning, documentation, storage, and disposition. A good collections policy covers a broad range of topics, including but not limited to the description of the museum's collections and collections-related goals, acquisition, accessioning, and deaccessioning criteria, outgoing and incoming loans, management of non-accessioned objects in the custody of the museum, care of the collections, documentation, and record-keeping systems, insurance and risk management, collections inventories, reproduction, copyright, and other legal and ethical issues related to the collections, access to the collections, review and revision of the policy. And this list appears on page 4 of our text by Simmons, Things Great and Small Collections Management Policies. A collections development policy is a written document approved by the governing library or archives, collections-related activities, including accessioning, documentation, storage, and weeding. Our text by Hoffman, Library Collection Development Policies, Academic, Public, and Special Libraries, has an extensive list of the components of a collections development policy on page 3. Things to be covered include, but are not limited to, purpose statement, background statement, responsibility for collection development, mission, goals, and objective statements, target audiences, budgeting and funding, evaluative criteria, format statement, government publications, treatment of specific resource groups, special collections, resource sharing, services statement, selection aids, copyright statement, intellectual freedom statement, acquisition, gifts, and exchange statement, collection maintenance statement, weeding statement, collection evaluation section, policy revision statement, definitions of terms and glossary, bibliography, and appendices. Just by looking at the list of components to include in a collections management policy and those to include in a collections development policy, we can see some of the differences between a collections management policy and a collections development policy. The major difference between museum collections management policies and library archives collections development policies has to do with the fact that museums accept collections in perpetuity. There are very strict regulations that guide the deaccessioning or disposal of collections. This means that in order to uphold its fiduciary responsibilities to the public it serves, a museum's deaccessioning policies must be approved by the highest level of the museum's governing authority, for example, the board of directors or trustees. For libraries and archives, the disposal of materials from the collections is also guided by regulations laid out in the collections development policy. However, it is usually the librarian who has direct oversight of the collection that has delegated the authority to make decisions about what to weed. The collections plan is a much different document than a collections management or development policy. A collections plan establishes a vision for the collections that best serve the institution's mission, compares the existing collections to that vision, and maps out how the institution will achieve the ideal collections that match its vision. A collections plan is not a set of guidelines like a collections management or development policy. It is a strategic plan that maps out the institution's goals and objectives related to its collections activities lays out the steps necessary to fulfill the indicated goals and objects, and identifies the resources, both financial and human, that are needed to achieve the indicated goals and objectives. A common mistake that I encounter often in interactions with other museums is that staff do not know the difference between policies, plans, and procedures. Policies establish the standards that regulate an institution's activities. Plans map out goals and objectives that help institutions evolve and meet the challenges laid out for them in their policies. Although a collections management or development policy must change as the institution, professional standards, and best practices evolve, they are not inherently time limited. A collections plan, on the other hand, is an ongoing process of deciding the museum's specific activities. It specifies what will be accomplished in a given period, why, by whom, and with what resources. Policies supply the standards for decision-making and the guidelines for taking action in a given situation. They must be approved by the appointed governing authority, as that person or leadership body is legally and ethically accountable for the museum's actions. Procedures, on the other hand, specify the mechanisms and details needed to implement the policy. Procedures are subject to frequent revision, and appropriate staff members have the authority to change them. Because procedures are subject to frequent revision and do not need to undergo the rigorous formal approval process that policies do, procedures should be set down in separate documents that can be easily altered whenever the need arises, and by whomever is responsible for overseeing the activities for which the procedures are needed. So that was an overview of what the policies are all about and the differences between policies, plans, and procedures. So if anyone has any questions, we're ready for that.
So I'm going to go ahead and see if the folks, I'm going to look around here first in Sarasota and see if anyone has any questions. I'm getting news. So now I'm going to check in with the folks down at Miami at the Wilsonian to see if they have any questions. If you could hop on the mic, it would be appreciated.
We currently don't have any questions.
Excellent. And do you guys have anything you'd like to talk to the group up in St. Augustine?
We also don't have any comments. Thank you.